Hello and welcome to Story Rhyme with Brendan, where I read a story or a poem for you. This time I'll read the final part 6 of the Adventures of Ralph Rashleigh by JamesTucker. This story is about a convict to Australia. In part 5, Ralph was taken to Newcastle to serve in the coal mines there. His escape with a convict crew up the northern New South Wales coast and became an odd inclusion in an aboriginal tribe. That is after a river flooded, putting his escape up the coast to an end. I'm not sure what happened to the last survivor of the convict crew that was with him, Roberts. He was swept away in the floodwaters too. Maybe he drowned and the aborigines were only able to save Ralph. Well, let's continue. Chapter 23. Rashliegh had been too long inured to hardship to suffer any ill effects from the savage conditions in which he was forced to live, which were in any case free from the brutal punishment which had been his intermittent lot since he had reached the colony. To return to the white population meant almost certain death, and he grew firmer in his resolution to remain with the blacks and to end his days with them. At the end of about 4.5 years, however, an event occurred which had unexpected consequences. His foster father, the old Korenji, died. He had for long been growing steadily more decrepit, and at last sank into a state of torpor which was only distinguishable from death by his slow and hardly discernible breathing. During this last illness the entire tribe was ceaseless in their attentions, and when at last death came to prove their efforts unavailing, the warriors and gins broke into peals of lamentations so loud and discordant that Rashleigh was appalled. The wailing which ensued upon the pronouncement that the Korenji was dead was still in progress when a powerful black, ambitious to succeed in the Korenji ship, flung himself full length upon the corpse, applied his lips to those of the dead, and inhaled deeply for some moments. As the man rose, one of the gins, with a great show of stealth, cut an incision with a sharp stone in the dead man's back, and dragging out the kidneys, threw them onto the breast of the corpse, and then ran off. Several gins, uttering loud lamentations and ceremonial reproaches, pursued her for some distance, after which they all returned, the apparently offending gin escaping further molestation. The Korenji elect had at once pounced upon the kidneys, which he gruesomely stripped of the shriveled yellow fat, and then replaced in the corpse, the incision being sewed up by Laura with kangaroo sinew threaded through a bone needle. The body was next anointed with the gum which was normally used in place of pitch upon the canoes and weapons, and the head was decorated by vari-coloured feathers, which were stuck to the bald skull with the same material. The corpse was then wrapped in a new opossum skin rug, the fur turned inwards, and the exposed surface fancifully daubed with crude designs in coloured earths. A rough structure was then erected, made like a table of green boughs, upon which the corpse was laid. A number of small fires were then lit at a short distance along each side, and 4 unarmed warriors began to walk sombrely round the corpse, waving green boughs over it, at times making fainting rushes as if to drive away some invisible being, chanting the whole time a monotonous dirge. This mourning ceremony continued throughout the day and night until the funeral, which, like all their important occasions, was fixed to take place at sunrise. A party of warriors, using the gins' wooden paddles, were detailed to dig the grave. None slept during the night, which was filled continually with renewed lamentations and funeral dances, and the fires were kept brightly burning. As the grey light of dawn appeared, the grave diggers came to announce that all was ready, and the entire tribe assembled for the obsequies of their Korenji. The men were unarmed, their bodies smeared horribly with coloured earths, white and red predominating, and each man carried a shell in one hand and a green bow in the other. 8 warriors now took up the rough stretcher on which the body lay, turned it so that it was carried feet first, and the procession to the grave began. Men, women, and children gashing and scratching their bodies with shells, until by the time they reached the graveside every one was running with blood. It looked to Rashleigh as though the people vied with each other as to who should cut themselves the deepest, in evidence of grief for the departed chief. The burial ground, like the council place, commanded a view of the sea, and Rashleigh noticed that, although it was only lightly timbered, each of the graves had been dug near a tree. He was amazed to realise that in all his long sojourn with the tribe he had never seen this place before, although he must have passed near it often, and when he noticed that the bark of each grave tree had been stripped to leave the trunk bare for an area of about 2 feet by 1, his astonishment increased. By these bare spaces he saw that crude designs had been carved representing kangaroos, bandicoots, snakes, and birds. The larger trees he saw had several such memorials engraved upon them, corresponding to the number of graves which had been made around them. The body was laid upon the ground, a green bow being placed in the right hand of the dead Korangi, which lay across his breast. Then every member of the tribe walked around the corpse, making a farewell obeisance, wailing and gashing their bodies anew during the ceremony. The grave was a pit about 5 feet square and 8 feet deep, in which were standing 4 upright stakes with sheets of bark forming a kind of box. The 2 poles to serve as skids were placed at one side. Rashleigh and the new Korangi then placed the body on the skids and held it there until the instant when the sun showed above the horizon, when they let go their hold, and the body slid gently down to remain erect, held by the 4 upright stakes, facing towards the sea. Armed with paddles, a number of the warriors shovelled earth into the pit, between the sides of the bark walls of the rough sepulchre, while others leapt in to tread the earth firm, until it reached the level of the head. The deceased's weapons were now placed in the bark tomb, which was then covered by another sheet of bark, so that no earth should press against the body. The pit was then filled in, and a neat mound nearly 3 feet in height was beaten smooth with paddles over it. The ceremony ended with the carving of a fish-hawk on the nearest tree, the significance of the emblem being to suggest the name of the Korangi, which would be translated as the swooping warrior. Ralph Rashleigh, sensible though he was of all that he owed to the old man, felt during the whole of this ceremony nothing deeper than the quality of grief that a man endures at the death of a dog or a horse to which he has been attached. He had never been able to consider the ugly and revolting old Korangi as really human, and there had been none of that tenderness of comradeship which might have aroused normal human affection between them. He soon discovered, however, that he had owed his safety and freedom from molestation to the powerful influence of the dead man, who had managed to hold in check the savage antipathy which the warriors felt towards him because of his mental superiority and the favoritism he enjoyed from their headman. From the attitude of the tribesmen towards him now that he had lost that protection, he realized that they would readily kill him but for the superstitious belief that the spirit of the old Korangi was haunting the place, ready to avenge any injury which might be done to his adopted white son. This superstitious fear, however, began to dwindle before a month had passed, for one day Tarawello, the new Korangi, informed Rashleigh that he must either give up to him the 2 gins of his predecessor or fight for the right to keep them. Rashleigh's only reason for keeping the 2 gins had been their own expressed desire to remain with him, rather than go to any of the blacks, who would not treat them so well. But now the manner of contemptuous superiority with which Terawillo presented his demand made him determined to keep them. He also knew from experience in friendly contests in the past that he was the muscular superior of any man in the tribe, who in spite of their large bodies were poor specimens of humanity. Rashleigh therefore told the new chief that he intended to accept his challenge and fight according to usage, which prescribed that any man possessing 2 or more wives must yield up all except one to any man who proved himself stronger or more expert in the use of weapons than he. Terawillo's answer was an attempted blow with a nulla nulla at the white man's head. Rashleigh, who had been watching the black's eyes, dodged, thrust his head between Terawillo's legs, and, with a heave, flung him violently over his back to the ground. Snatching up the fallen warrior's weapon, he dealt him a crushing blow which broke the arm which the chief had raised to protect his head. He was about to strike again, but recovered his self-control, flung the waddy down, and called to the chief's gin to come and help her man away. Jumba came running up, yelling something about the chief being killed, and tried to secure Rashleigh, who, after warning him, struck him senseless to the ground and walked quietly over to his own fire. Neither Jumba nor Terawillo attempted to molest him during the day, but after this quarrel he became the object of the hate and the fear of the blacks. His gins dared no more to go fishing or root digging with the other women, who fell upon them and beat them mercilessly. Indeed, the whole tribe seemed to be in a conspiracy to make life as miserable as could be for them and their master. One night, about a week after the fight, Laura seemed to Rashleigh to be unusually silent and depressed, entirely unlike her cheery, chattering self. Usually she eagerly drew him out about the manners, customs, and clothing of the women of his race, never tiring of hearing of their strangeness. This evening she scarcely spoke, but often glanced guardedly around the environs of their fire. He asked her whether she was ill, but her only reply was a caress, after which they lay down together and went to sleep. He was awakened suddenly by a piercing scream from Laura, and starting up, he saw her struggling wildly in Jumba's arms. As he rose to rush to help her, she cried to him in warning, "Look behind you, Yaff, never mind Laura." He wheeled round and saw Terawillo, who, having already discharged one spear, which was shivering in the earth beside where Rashleigh had lain, was fixing another spear in his woomera. The Englishman wrenched the spent spear from the earth and rushed upon the black before he could discharge his second spear, and plunged it into his abdomen with such force that it came out through his back close to the spine. Laura's cries were growing fainter, and, turning from his prone enemy, Rashleigh saw her on the ground and Jumba above her, beating her with his nulla nulla, the knobbed end of which weighed about 10 pounds. Not waiting to pick up another weapon, he charged the cowardly black, whose back was towards him, and leapt so that his feet struck in the middle of his spine, brought him crashing to the earth on his face. Before Jumba knew quite what had happened, Rashleigh caught the dropped nulla nulla, and with a single blow crushed in the black man's skull, instantly avenging the poor gin, who had just life enough to attempt to caress him as he bent over her, before falling back dead. At this tragedy, Rashleigh ran amok. He snatched up the club where he had let it fall after dispatching Jumba, and rushed to Terawillo, who was surrounded by friends in consultation about the wisdom of attempting to pull the spear from his body. Heedless of the screech of terror from the lips of the wounded chief, Rashleigh brought his club down upon his head, dashing out his brains. The chief's friends attacked him in a swarm, but the enraged white man brought 3 of them crashing to the earth before he was disarmed and secured. He was brought as a prisoner before the assembled tribe next morning for trial, the dead bodies of Terawillo and Jumba being laid out surrounded by their wailing gins and relatives. Rashleigh was asked simply why he had killed the two warriors. "There were 3 dead bodies last night," he replied. "Why are there only 2 this morning?" A warrior leaped up in fury and addressed the savage court. "The white man means, brothers, where is the body of his gin?" he shouted in the native tongue, as if he meant to say that he had killed our chief and Jumba to revenge her death. "Let my black brothers teach the pale stranger that they do not so far worship weak women as to hold that her death could be any excuse for the fall of 2 brave warriors." "It is true," rejoined Rashleigh. "I killed Jumba and Terrawillow because they killed Laura, but also they had tried to kill me, which they would have done had not my poor Gin lost her life to save mine." "You had better cry for your Gin like a child," shouted the warrior scornfully. "I should like to see a white man's tears." "That you may do," said Rashleigh, seeing in this altercation a chance to get his limbs free. "See if you can make them flow. Unbind my hands, and give me a nulla nulla, and try. You will not? No, you are afraid, knowing well I would quickly make you weaker than any woman." An aged black interposed, whispering something in the angry warrior's ear, which caused him to nod his head acquiescently and sit down. The old fellow then made a round of all the elder warriors, holding a consultation in low tones, finally returning to his place and sitting silent for a while. "Pale stranger," he began at last, "you were once thrown out of the sea upon our fishing ground, and a wise man, who is no more, but had been a mighty warrior in his younger days, saw in your face the likeness to a son who had passed away. Because of this he saved your life, and made you into a warrior. For these things, which were very good, you have brought evil on our tribe. 2 stout men, who yesterday could have helped to defend us against our foes, are today dead by your hand. For all this justice forbids us to take your life, because those 2 who are gone tried first to kill you before your club was lifted against them. But you may not stay with us longer, lest the angry spirits of the departed take vengeance on the tribe for letting you live unpunished. Go then, take your women, your dogs, and your weapons. The land is wide. Dwell where you will, but come no more near our hunting ground. I have spoken. Do as I say. Well, my brothers?" An acquiescent grunt, usual on such occasions, came from the assembled warriors. "Will you go then, in peace, and leave us?" he concluded. "I will go," said Rashleigh. "The sun is as hot, and the fish are as fat elsewhere as they are here." At a sign from the old orator, his bonds were loosened. The ancient paused and looked around the encircling faces. "If any of our black brethren do not like the decision of the elders, now that the pale stranger is free, let them attack him in the face of all the tribe, and take better vengeance for the fallen on fair and equal terms." 2 warriors at once leapt to their feet, but the one who had taunted the prisoner claimed precedence, and it was arranged that they should fight at noon. Rashleigh thereupon retired to his fires, where he found his 2 surviving Gins wailing and gashing themselves over the battered corpse of Laura, which they had laid out ready for interment. Rashleigh decided that he would not bury the body near the tribe, so he constructed a rough sort of hand barrow, into which he placed it. He then ordered the 2 Gins to carry it northward along the beach as far as an inlet which was generally admitted to be the boundary of the fishing ground belonging to the tribe. There they were to await his arrival, taking with them the dogs, his fishing tackle, and all his weapons, except the one which he was to use in the combat at noon. The shadows of the trees were at their feet when all the tribe were duly assembled on their council ground overlooking the sea. The fight began instantly by Rashleigh's opponent, as usual, offering his head for a blow. "Have done with such fooling," shouted the white man, "for if you put your head in my way again, you will need no second blow." The black began by clumsy feigning, when Rashleigh riposted by also feigning as if to strike the man's head. and bringing his club round suddenly struck him heavily upon his knee. The black fell prostrate, and as none came forward to help him, and everyone seemed to be waiting to see the death blow delivered, Rashleigh cried out scornfully, "Take your warrior away. I will not rob your tribe of any more," and then walked away from the astounded assembly in the direction in which his gins had gone. The fight had been so short that he soon overtook the women, and lifting Laura's body from the handcart which he abandoned, he carried it in his arms, never stopping until night. At first he was irritated by the wailing of the two gins, and at last he ordered them sternly to desist, so that they went in silence until the day's march ended. They prepared a fire at the camping place and chatted as usual about their usual tasks. One of them, named Innie, came back presently with a huge bonetta, which he had killed in a pool which had been left by the ebbing tide. The women prepared and cooked some slices, and begged Rashleigh to eat. His appetite, however, was lost in the grief he was feeling at the tragic death of his favourite and gallant little gin, and he bade them shortly to eat their food and get to sleep quickly. He spent the night in a melancholy vigil over the remains of the girl who had loved him so well that she had not hesitated to draw Jumba's attack upon herself, in order to leave him free to deal with the dastardly Terrawello. He pondered long on the devotion which Laura had lavished upon him, always acting towards him as if he were some friendly god whom it was an honour to serve with love. She was the first woman who had ever given him affection, and as he took a last look at her before going off to dig a grave, the thought passed through his mind that, however black her skin was, her heart was true. He wrapped her in his best opossum skin cloak, and buried her in a deep grave, with a thick layer of grasses to protect her body from the earth, under the shade of the hanging acacia tree growing beside a murmurous rivulet. As he shovelled the earth into the pit, tears ran down his cheeks, and a great sense of loss overwhelmed him. He lay mourning beside the grave all that day and the night that followed, watched secretly with awe and wonder by the two remaining gins. Next day they resumed their march, Rashleigh turning often to look back towards the spot where he had left the remains of the only woman outside his family who had ever loved him. Chapter 24. For nearly 6 months after leaving the tribe, Rashleigh and his gins pursued the northerly course along the beach, crossing rivers by catamarans, sleeping under cliffs, in caverns, or in the open according to opportunity and the weather. Their diet was chiefly fish, caught easily by torchlight, varied by cockles, oysters, limpets, and roots whenever they could be come by. He passed through many tribes of coastal blacks. With some of them he was able to converse. He assumed the character of a wandering Karangi, which he was able to sustain easily with the experience he had gained from his long association with his ancient foster father. Knowing how to paint signs upon his body and decorate himself in the traditional manner of the doctor priests, he was in consequence never molested by the aborigines, through whose territories he passed, but, on the contrary, was always received hospitably and allowed to remain as long as he wished in their camps, and to depart when he pleased. Frequently the warriors tried eagerly to persuade him to abandon his wandering life and stay with them permanently as their Karangi. This, however, he would not do, fatalistically pursuing his original plan of going northwards, which had been conceived at the start of his ill-omened journey with Roberts, Hennessy, Owen, and the rest, when they had succeeded in escaping the search of the crew of the Newcastle pilot boat. He reached at last the most northerly point on the coast of New Holland, at the entrance to Torres Straits. From the crest of a lofty mountain he could see many small islands, which he supposed formed part of the Indian archipelago, and he looked towards them with longing, as seats of that lost civilization to which he belonged. He found himself longing for his old companions, for he realized that, if even only Roberts had been spared, they might together have contrived some means to cross the strait, which, in spite of intricate channels formed by adverse currents, was negotiable in places. He lay nearly the whole day on the mountain, looking out to sea and consumed with vain regrets and frustrated hopes, and when he returned to the beach at nightfall, he found the gins much alarmed at his prolonged absence. They resumed their march next morning, and had not gone far when, with a thrill of excitement, he saw about a mile from shore the hulk of a wrecked vessel which, from the mountain top, he had taken to be part of one of the rocks on which she lay. The tide was running out and the sea was calm, but he feared to attempt the swim because of the numerous sharks which infested the waters. There was no wood at hand for the construction of a catamaran, but, explaining to the gins his intention of trying to reach the wreck, he sent them along the shore to search for any timbers that might have been washed up, whilst he occupied himself in plaiting into cords all the fishing lines they carried, for tying together the timbers of the raft he hoped to build. He was interrupted by Tita, one of the gins, cooing loudly to him from a spot some distance along the beach, and making excited signs. Hastening over to her, he found one of the tops of the wrecked ship, with the bodies of 4 seamen lashed to it, all in an advanced stage of decomposition. He cut loose the fastenings, and, digging a great hole in the sand, buried the bodies of the 4 unfortunate men together. As the gins were helping him drag the corpses to the hole, a considerable quantity of gold coins rolled from the pocket of one of the men. The gins, attracted by the glitter of the shining metal, refused to do another hand's turn in helping Rashleigh with his gruesome task, until they had collected all they could find. He was anxious to complete his last offices to the drowned men, and knew that the money was in any case useless in his present circumstances. When the simple burial was completed, they searched further and found 2 strong booms, which, with the top, Rashleigh soon lashed together into a raft large enough for his immediate need. He fashioned 2 rough paddles from scraps of wood for the gins, and made a longer steering paddle for himself. He launched the raft immediately it was ready, and in a short time, helped by the falling tide and the gins' vigorous paddling, reached the wreck. The ill-fated vessel, a sailing ship of some 500 tons burthen, was stripped of masts, bulwarks, and forecastle, her foredeck having been literally swept bare by the gale, which seemed to have just missed cutting her in two. Abaft the main chains, she lay canted to one side in an indentation on the reef, which upheld her as firmly as the stocks upon which she had been built, and to Rashleigh it seemed a hopeless task to try to get aboard her. Not a rope hung down, and the bowsprit having been carried away close to the head, neither bridle nor martingale remained over which a rope could be thrown. The only thing he could see that offered any hope was the stanchion still standing near the forechains. He took the cord which he had made ashore and fastened to the end a stone which Eni used for a sinker to her fishing line. With this he went round to the lower side of the wreck, casting the weighted end towards the stanchion in the hope that it would twist round in such a way as to enable him to haul himself on deck. He desisted only when he was too tired to throw, and sat down in despair, and was puzzling his brains for some alternative scheme, when Eni touched him on the arm, and, taking up the weighted line, said, "Me try now." Rashleigh smiled as she began to coil the rope in her left hand, and to swing the loaded end round her head with a peculiar action. With a jerk she let the end fly from her hand, and next instant the rope was fixed fast to the stanchion. After testing the rope, Rashleigh climbed to the sloping deck and slipped down the open companionway which led to the principal cabin. Everything was in confusion, and as he gazed round he was startled to hear a low moan, as of a human being in pain, come from the direction of one of the sleeping berths beyond. The door was jammed, and he had to knock out 2 of the panels before he could enter. What at first glance he took to be a pile of clothing lying on the bunk, he found to be bed coverings, under which lay the bodies of 2 women and a child, all emaciated by starvation and seemingly dead. He gently turned over the woman nearest to him, and at his touch her eyes flickered open, and a piteous moan escaped her. Seeing the bearded face of a black man peering at her, she shuddered and clutched her babe convulsively to her bony breast. She looked into Rashleigh's eyes with a gaze so touchingly pathetic in its pleading that tears sprang to his eyes. He recovered himself immediately, and at once set off in search of food and drink with which to revive the women and child. There was nothing in the main cabin, but after a search forward he found wine and a keg of water, which he carried back to the sleeping quarters. Among the debris in the cabin he found a tumbler, in which he mixed a little wine with water, with which he moistened the lips of the 3 sufferers, and was overjoyed to find that the second woman was also alive. The child at first drank eagerly, and then began to cry, "Mama, Mama, take the black man away." The mother put her arm round the child in a feeble but reassuring caress, while Rashleigh left them and went on deck. He threw the end of a rope taken from the sailors' quarters to the gins, bidding them make the raft fast and come on board. As he waited for them, he looked round anxiously to see what the weather portents were, as the day was far advanced, and he wished to stay aboard until morning, if it were likely to be safe to do so. He realized that if it were to blow at all hard, the ship could not survive the battering of the waves for more than 4 or 5 hours. He could see no signs of wind or broken weather, but he decided to confirm his opinion, and when Enid came back on deck, he asked her what she thought. She looked round, and at once replied, "Very much hot day tomorrow will be." Telling her to go below, he repeated his question to Tita as she reached the deck. Tita made a much longer survey, but at last gave the same opinion as Enid, that it would be a very much hot day tomorrow. This opinion from women of a race who have an uncanny sense in such matters set Rashleigh's mind at rest, and he went below to find Enid wonderstruck by all the strangeness around her, and the child crying lustily for food. He set the gins to work to light some sort of fire in the cabin grate, and went off in search of food. He came upon what he took to be the steward's room, in which he found some tins of preserved meat, biscuits, flour, tin, sugar, and other eatables, with a quantity of which he returned to the cabin, taking a tea kettle with him. He found the gins had got going a good fire, but were superstitiously scared by the sound of its roaring in the chimney, and it was not until he had explained to them that it was only the draught and the smoke that caused the noise that they were convinced that the sound was not of supernatural origin. He then, with the help of the gins, concocted a weak soup into which he crumbled some biscuit and spoon-fed the women and the child in turn. He himself sat down to the first plentiful meal of European food which he had tasted for nearly 5 years, eating salted beef and biscuit washed down with tea with almost childish relish. Tita and Enid gorged themselves upon great quantities of biscuits soaked in strongly sweetened tea. It was not going to be easy to get the woman and child ashore, as they were all far too weak to help themselves in any way, and the dangerous state of the wreck made it imperative that they should leave it at the earliest possible moment. He determined to construct a larger raft from the hatches and gratings of the vessel, and lower the women and child in a cot onto it, with all the foodstuffs and useful furniture that he could find, and tow it ashore with the smaller catamaran. He could see that the hull would be battered to pieces if a storm should blow up, and he and the gins worked desperately through the night, and before morning had a large serviceable raft finished. They then collected all the useful movable articles. Enid lowered them to Rashliegh as fast as Tita could hand them to her. By daybreak all was in readiness, and Rashliegh, finding that the tide was now running out, attended to his invalid charges, and lay down to sleep. The sun was high when he woke, and the tide was running in strongly. He carried a large cot on deck, and secured it firmly to the stanchion, and returned to bring the 2 women and child. The infant clung desperately to its mother, so that he had perforce to carry the pair of them together, an easy task as, in their emaciated condition, they were no heavier than a young child. By means of a cunning arrangement of ropes, he eased the cot overside and down to the raft, the 2 gins standing ready to place it safely. Rashliegh then lowered himself and cast away. The 2 gins bent to their paddles, and he steered to a spot near some beetling cliffs, which looked as though it would provide good shelter and concealment. On landing, he and Tita carried the laden cot to a place overhung by a great rock, forming a kind of roof, and making a rough bed of some sails which he had brought off the ship, he placed the women and child upon it. The freight was then landed, and leaving the rescued people and the camp in charge of Enid with instructions as to signals should any blacks approach, Rashliegh returned to the wreck. He had little fear of blacks arriving, as the soil was very dry and poor in the vicinity, and there were no swamps or dense thickets in which were to be found the favourite foods of the aborigines. His purpose in returning to the wreck was to search for anything that he might have so far overlooked that might be serviceable for the comfort of the derelicts whom fate had thrown into his charge. He was relieved to find a plentiful supply of women's clothes in a trunk, as well as a large quantity of provisions which he had previously overlooked. In a desk in the cabin he found a large quantity of writing materials, and a considerable sum in the form of bills of exchange, all of which he took, overjoyed especially at the prospect of being able to write again after years of compulsory neglect. Also he found the carpenter's tools, firearms, and ammunition. The transportation of all that he wished to take ashore occupied him and Tita the whole of the day and far into the night. They laboured without rest for the fatiguing task, as there were ominous signs of a storm brewing, and they had not got ashore with their final load more than half an hour when a low moaning was heard coming out of the southwest, and in less than an hour a violent tempest was lashing the sea into a fury of waves. Rashliegh felt a great joy in his heart as he watched the leaping foam-flecked waters, and uttered a silent prayer of thanksgiving that he had arrived when he did, and not 36 hours later, when the wreck would have been engulfed and the woman and child drowned. The torrential rain began to fall, so he fixed a sail at the entrance of their cave-like retreat, and, making sure that they were well above high water mark, he lay down and slept. He awoke at daybreak in a quiet morning, rain and wind having ceased, though the sea still ran high, and the land glistened with a refreshing moisture. Great breakers were foaming skywards against the reef on which the wreck had been, but no sign of the vessel remained, except a few scraps of wreckage that were floating on the sea, and a few planks that had been washed ashore during the storm. For over a week Rashliegh occupied his time in building a rough dwelling under the rock which he had first selected, and where he meant to remain. It was both invisible and inaccessible from the land, and gave him a continuous watch upon the sea for passing vessels, one of which he hoped some day to signal. He put up stanchions made from the jetsam of the wreck across the seaward entrance to the cave, and nailed planking across so that they had a stout wall to protect them from the weather. He had brought from the wreck, with this building in mind, a door and 4 windows, which he now fixed, and was at last satisfied that he had a little house fit to shelter his unexpected guests. He then set to work to divide the place into 3 compartments, one of which was to serve as a combination of store and living room, and the other 2 as bedrooms, one for the 3 castaways and the other for Rashleigh and his gins. The partitions were made of lengths of sail, the walls of rock being covered with the same material. The 2 ladies remained in a state bordering on torpor during their first few days ashore, lacking the strength to speak or to help themselves in any way, but by the time Rashleigh had completed his house building, they had revived sufficiently to be able to express their thanks to him for all that they owed him. The child recuperated more quickly and was now running about. He was 7 years of age and very small for his years. The mother told him that the ill-fated vessel was named the Tribune, which had brought convicts from England, and had then been bound in ballast for Calcutta, whither she had been going with her sister and child to join her husband, a Captain Marby. The ladies had lost exact count of time, but it had been, they thought, 10 days before Rashleigh arrived that the Tribune had struck the reef. It had been blowing only moderately at the time, said Mrs. Marby, but the impact of the crash had jammed the door of the sleeping berth in which they had been lying half dead with seasickness. They had heard someone come and try to open the door, and soon after the sounds of the crew taking to the boats. Distracted with fear, the unfortunate women struggled until their strength was spent in futile efforts to force the door, and had at last given up in despair and lain down to die. Rashleigh, listening to their account of what had happened, and recalling the 4 corpses he had found lashed to the top, concluded that hardship and famine had made their memories uncertain, and that the callous desertion of the crew, as well as the comparative temperateness of the weather, were figments of their imaginations. All the consultations which they held as to the best means for escaping from their present situation ended in the same way. There was nothing to do but wait in the hope of being picked up by a passing ship. Rashleigh, pointing out that he could by no means guarantee, even in his character as a wandering Karenji, to protect the white women from hostile blacks, whom they would be bound to encounter if they set out along the beach for the hundreds of miles of journey to a white settlement. The policy of waiting was at least hopeful, as 2 or 3 vessels left Sydney for India during each year, and their route took them past that coast. Rashleigh searched the neighbourhood for the best point at which to fix the signal of distress, and at last selected the point of a promontory standing well out to sea, and there he erected a pole and fixed upon it, reversed, a Union Jack which he had found in a locker on the Tribune, and also ordered one of the gins to build a smoking fire at the spot every morning. His hope was that the smoke would attract attention, and that the flag would reveal to mariners that the fire was a signal from English folk in distress. The queerly assorted party lived a simple and abstemious life, eating sparingly of the provisions which they had salved from the ship, so that they might have for as long as possible some normal food for the ladies and the boy. Fish was the staple article of diet, and they discovered a vegetable plant not unlike spinach, which, boiled with salt beef, provided a palatable addition to their meagre bill of fare. Their water was supplied by a small spring in one of the adjacent cliffs, which provided a quantity just sufficient for their absolute requirements. Rashleigh had refrained from revealing his true race to the ladies, who believed his story that he was a New Holland aborigine, who had learned English and the ways of the whites through having been brought up from infancy until his 20th year in the family of an eminent officer of the colonial government at Sydney, on whose death he had returned to the life of a savage, which he preferred to the work and restraint of civilized society. His subterfuge was safe from betrayal by the jinns, whom he had cautioned to say nothing, as they were genuinely attached to him, and also feared him, not only for his superior strength and knowledge, but for a reason grounded in superstition. This superstition sprung from a belief prevalent among the aborigines that all the whites who made their appearance in Australia were reincarnations of the spirits of departed blacks. When a native saw a white person for the first time, he always gave him a native name derived from a fancied resemblance to some dead member of his own tribe, and it was in conformity with this notion that the ancient Karenji had given Rashleigh the name of Biala, which denoted a peculiarity in the walk of one of the old fellow's sons who had fallen in battle years before. This naming of the whites was the only way in which the blacks were permitted to recall or make reference to the dead, and they believed that persons so adopted by them possessed all the knowledge they had acquired by native usages in their previous black existence, in addition to the arts and knowledge of the white civilization. Consequently, the jinns regarded Rashleigh with awe as well as with affection, believing him to be possessed of double powers, and able to know the motives of actions and all things past and present. Months passed in a monotony only relieved for the two white women by the interest and fun they derived from teaching the jinns the manners of the white races, which the black girls learnt eagerly, and were particularly keen upon dressing themselves in any scraps of clothing which the ladies could spare. Rashleigh occupied himself with the camp duties of providing fuel and fish, keeping his arms in good condition, and teaching the jinns to read. Towards the white women, he maintained the attitude of a respectful native, serving them faithfully, and never taking the least advantage of their being helpless in his power. Daily he went to the beacon hill, and though he saw no sail, hope remained alive. Some day a ship was bound to come and take them off the inhospitable coast. One day, in the 8th month, as he stood there looking out to sea as usual, he turned his gaze northwards, and was perturbed to see, at a considerable distance, in that direction the smoke of many fires, betokening a camp of blacks. These were the first signs of the aborigines that he had seen since settling in the cave, and he decided to reconnoitre and discover their dispositions and intentions, in case they stumbled upon the habitation under the cliff. He refrained from making a fire, pulled down the post and flag, and hurried back to the cave to inform the women of what he had seen, telling them that it was imperative that they should go upon a scouting expedition. He was astonished to discover, from the scene which followed, how entirely the white women depended upon him for their peace of mind. Mrs. Marby begged him in moving words that he would not betray or desert them, and her sister and the boy added their separate entreaties, weeping at the prospect of being left even for a short time without him. He acceded at last in assuring them that they had nothing to fear from any action of his, and persuaded them of the necessity of his going. At nightfall he took off the sailor's dress which he had been wearing since the wreck, and, preparing himself in the guise of a Karenji, set out with a double-barreled gun and a pair of pistols concealed in his opossum skin belt. The strange camp was several miles distant, and he did not reach it until early morning. While it was still dark, the number of fires made it clear to him that the tribe was numerous, and according to native custom, he walked straight through to the chief's fire, unmolested by the many dogs which came up and sniffed him as he passed. The chief lay asleep and alone, so Rashleigh made up the fire, sat down, and smoked in silence until the savage awoke. Seeing one whom he judged to be a Karenji sitting there and eating smoke, he sat up and addressed the stranger. "Is my brother Karenji hungry that he devours the wind of fire?" he asked. "I devoured the fire wind
to make me wise, but not to satisfy my hunger, replied Rashleigh. Is the tribe of my brother far away? My fathers dwelt many moons nearer to the rain than this, but I wander through the lands at my pleasure. Does my brother, conjured the chief curiously, travel so far without a jinn to wait upon him? A wise man waits upon himself, answered Rashleigh solemnly, but, he added meaningly, all the jinns of the weakest are mine. That is true and just, assented the black, but is not my brother lonely for want of company? I need no company but my own thoughts and the spirits of the wise men who are departed, but who hover around us everywhere, ready to come to anyone who is bold enough to call them. At this statement the chief rose, casting a fearful glance round him, and replenishing the fire with a handful of dry fuel, looked long and earnestly at his visitor. During this scrutiny Rashleigh calmly refilled his pipe, adding a few grains of powder to his tobacco. At length the chief remarked in an awe-stricken whisper, "'Tis very true. Our fathers have told us that the spirits of the dead are everywhere, but none of our tribe ever thought it safe to call on them. Do these dreadful visitants never try to injure the hardy warrior who seeks their company?" "Be certain, my brother," said Rashleigh, "that not every Korengi can control the tempers of the dead. He, however, who can speak to them with words of fire need never fear aught they can do." As he spoke, the gunpowder in his pipe flared up, and at such a striking commentary to his words, the chief immediately gave signs of the deep respect in which he held the stranger, and Rashleigh was satisfied with the effect he had made. At daybreak the camp was in commotion, and Rashleigh was thronged by warriors, eagerly seeking news of the movements of the tribes along the coast. He told them all he knew, and was pleased to see that all he said was news to them. A hunt was proposed, during which he was able to add to the effect he had made as a marvellous Korengi by his prowess with his gun. A great feast was held in honour of his visit, and during the ensuing drunkenness he slipped away unobserved, thus adding to the impression of magical powers which would stand him in good stead in the case of trouble later. To prevent the blacks from tracking him, he swam part of the way back and reached the cabin unmolested. Thereafter he refrained from lighting the beacon fire and flying the flag, he and Eni sharing lookout watches for ships. The tribe remained for many weeks in the neighbourhood in which Rashleigh had found them, and during this time he paid them repeated visits, always contriving his appearances and withdrawals in so sudden and mysterious a manner that they came to regard him as having the power to make himself invisible at will. One night, oppressed by anxiety and the lack of any sign of rescue, he had wandered to the top of a neighbouring hill, from which he saw signs that the blacks were holding a night council, such as was only held in times of great emergency. Swiftly he assumed his disguise as a Korengi and hastened towards the camp of the tribe. He paused on the outskirts and saw that the warriors, armed and equipped for battle, were engaged in a frightful war dance of the kind used to stimulate themselves to the highest pitch of ferocity in preparation for an important enterprise. The dance was accompanied by an extemporaneous song, reciting the great exploits of their past warriors of renown, and bragging of the manner in which they would outdo them during the fight they were about to begin. Rashleigh knew enough of their language to gather from the fragments of the song which he heard that there was not far off a ship manned by white men in some sort of distress, and that its commander, foolishly thinking to purchase the goodwill of these treacherous savages, had treated them kindly, and had made them gifts of the gewgaws used in barter, and had evidently been mad enough to give them rum. Having learnt this much, Rashleigh slipped unobserved among the excited mob, appearing suddenly and laying his hand on the chief's shoulder. The chief gave a loud cry of alarm, and turned, but seeing the mysterious Korengi said in a sulky tone, "My brother is welcome, if he comes as a friend." "Your lips speak words that are not in your heart," replied Rashleigh. "You do not wish me to be here, lest I should defeat your intended attack on the big canoe of the white strangers." "My brother knows everything," cried Newcastle, the chief, in great surprise, "but he will join our tribe in plundering the power rulers of the wind. First tell me, O Newcastle, whether you love your own people." "Why should a wise Korenji ask that?" demanded the mystified chief. "He knows I do." "Then, if you do, let the white men depart in peace. They have plenty weapons like mine, and even if you conquer them, many of your tribe must die. And what will happen to those that are left? Can you tell me that, O Newcastle?" The black shook his head and made no other answer. "Then I will tell you. The fire water of the white men will make them mad. They will drink till they fight, fight till they kill, and kill till none remains alive." "'Tis no matter," cried Newcastle defiantly. "My brother speaks with the words of a coward. He looks like a man, but his heart is that of a jinn." During this talk they had strayed to the edge of the sea, at a spot which Rashleigh had previously marked, and while the chief was speaking, he put a small quantity of gunpowder into his pipe, and as it exploded and dazzled the black, Rashleigh slipped into the water and swam quickly to the side of the bay where, he guessed from what he had heard, were some goods belonging to the white men. He wandered about the shore for some minutes before he found the expected stores, and he decided to conceal himself in the middle of them until morning, when he hoped that he would have some opportunity to warn the white men of their danger. He determined that if he could hit upon no other way, he would take the risk of the shark-infested water and swim off to the vessel, which he judged would be within easy distance. In the morning twilight he saw the ship to which the natives had referred as the big canoe. It was a schooner, as nearly as he could judge, of about 100 tons burthen, which had gone ashore on the point of a low-lying sandy islet. Gazing at her in the increasing light, with the hope of rescue at last strong within him, he saw 2 heavily laden boats put off and start towards the point where he lay concealed. The blacks also began to appear, some of them making a pretence of fishing near the pile of stores, while a few of the more important, with Newcastle in their midst, walked right up to where Rashleigh was hiding, laughing and evidently in the highest spirits. He crouched low, for although they seemed unarmed, he saw that they carried short clubs in the tufts of opossum skin which hung from their belts behind. Rashleigh, certain that some treacherous attack was imminent, held himself ready for action the moment the boats touched the shore. A man, who was evidently the captain of the schooner, stepped onto the beach and held out a hand to Newcastle, who had approached him. Rashleigh saw the malignant gleam in the chief's eye as he extended his left hand to grasp the right hand of the captain, while with his right he gripped the concealed club. In a glance the watcher saw that, as the sailors landed, each of them was similarly greeted by one of the blacks. The chief, Newcastle, swung his club, and instantly Rashleigh's gun spoke, and the cunning black fell without a cry, a bullet through his brain. The sham Korenji leapt at once from his hiding place. "Beware, white man," he yelled. "These treacherous brutes mean to murder the lot of you." The sailors needed no warning that foul play was intended, for at Newcastle's signal each of the blacks had seized one of them, and they were about to imitate their chief, when the unexpected report of the gun and the fall of Newcastle startled them for an instant, giving the sailors time to break loose and retreat into their boats. The captain was calling to them to come back, when Rashleigh interposed, suggesting that they should make for the ship with all speed and return with arms, the sailors having been so deluded by the apparent friendliness of the blacks that they had come ashore without so much as a pistol or a cutlass among them. The skipper had only time to shout his orders to his men before the blacks, enraged at the death of their chief, closed together and rushed at the white men with spears, boomerangs and clubs, which had been brought by reserves who had been hiding in the thicket that fringed the beach. The first volley of spears brought down one of the sailors, but before they could bring the fight to close quarters, Rashleigh fired into them with both barrels of his gun, and as they paused, blazed at them with his pistol. This treatment at the hands of the mysterious Korangi terrified the leaderless warriors, who turned tail and fled to the cover of the thicket. There they remained, and no further incident occurred before the boat's crew returned with a supply of arms, and with the cheering information that the ship was now almost afloat on the rising tide, a pull of 2 on the forward anchor, they said, and the schooner would be riding free. The captain's first thought was for his ship, and he at once proposed that they should all return to her and get her clear of the bank. Rashleigh volunteered his help, offering to remain and stand guard over the stores, provided they would leave with him the arms they had brought ashore. This friendly offer the captain at first refused, declaring that he would not, for 20 times as valuable a quantity of goods, dream of allowing the man who had so gallantly saved them from wholesale slaughter by the blacks to take any further risk on their behalf. Rashleigh, however, persisted that his plan should be adopted, and explained to the captain that he knew his countrymen well enough to be sure that they were extremely unlikely to renew the attack, especially now that they must know that he had a number of guns. The other allowed himself to be persuaded to return to the schooner with all his men to get her right off the bank, and Rashleigh remained with a row of rifle arms ready cocked, laid out upon packing cases, patrolling the spot with his double-barrelled gun in his hand. He kept a keen watch shorewards, but he saw no sign of any blacks, and at first the only sound that broke the quietude was the murmur of the waves breaking on the beach. The sailors had evidently reached the ship again, for he could hear the capstan chanty coming across the water. He turned to watch whether they were going to succeed in pulling off the bank. For some minutes the efforts were ineffectual, but then he saw her plainly moving, and she was just running into free water when Rashleigh was struck in the back of his leg by a spear. He turned as a flight of spears fell all around him among the ship's stores, and cursed himself for a fool for having relaxed his vigilance. For some moments he could see no one, nor could he guess from what point the attack had been made, until he saw a head appear from behind a sandbank. Before the black had time to move, Rashleigh brought his gun to his shoulder and fired. The young man sprang high in his last convulsion and fell dead, as another volley of spears was flung, one of them piercing Rashleigh's shoulder. He dropped quickly behind a cask, crouching to pull the spear from his leg, and the blacks, evidently thinking that he had been brought down by one of their spears, rose from their cover and came towards him at a run. He dropped one of them, but the rest had apparently overcome their fear of the noise of the gun, and rushed him before he had time to lift another musket. The only thing to do was to club his fowling piece and lay about him in the hope of keeping them at bay until help arrived from the ship. He had felled several of the enemy, when one husky black sprang in and caught him round the middle. Rashleigh let fall his weapon and wrestled his man, the pair coming to the ground with a crash, and rolling over and over, until for a second Rashleigh had the other flat on his back. Without hesitation, he snatched his pistol from his belt and fired point blank into his opponent's face, killing him instantly. He was about to leap to his feet when he heard shots coming from the sea, and saw the blacks coming off at a great pace towards cover. He therefore lay still until the firing ceased. The captain landed with the crew of the boat, and gave a yell of delight when he saw Rashleigh rise and come towards him, wounded and bleeding, but alive. He insisted upon rowing him straight out to his vessel and having his wounds properly dressed by the steward, all the time pouring out his gratitude to Rashleigh for the great service he had done him that day. He told the wounded men that his schooner was the Seamew of Sydney, homeward bound from a trading trip among the Fiji Islands. When his wounds had been dressed, Rashleigh told the captain the story of the wreck of the Tribune and his rescue of the 3 survivors, and discovered that he had heard of the ship and had actually left at Timor Kupan, a vessel which had been dispatched from New South Wales by Colonel Woodville, Mrs. Marby's father, in search of his daughters and grandson. News that the women and child were left on board had been reported by a party of the craven crew of the Tribune, who had successfully made the southward voyage in their boat to Fort Macquarie. The captain told Rashleigh that everyone who knew them would be delighted at the rescue, as Colonel Woodville was greatly respected by all classes of colonists, and was known to be seriously ill as a result of the shock of the feared loss of his daughters. He volunteered at once to take them on board as soon as he had got through the job of reloading his stores, after which he would sail round to the bay on the shores of which the crude cabin dwellings stood. They arrived early on the following morning, the mood of the ladies and the gins vaulting suddenly from the despair into which Rashleigh's prolonged absence had flung them, to delirious happiness at the imminent prospect of leaving the gloomy cabin and the voyaging at once to Sydney. Rashleigh was regarded by the rescued and rescuers as a hero, and the captain granted his request for a passage for himself and the gins, asserting that if Rashleigh had not come of his own free will, he would have pressed him by main force. Before evening the anchor was weighed, and the Seamew set sail for Sydney. Chapter 25. The excitement of getting away at last from the lair on the inhospitable coast died down for Rashleigh, as he pondered on his probable fate at the end of the voyage. His mind was heavy with forebodings, despite the fact that he could fairly expect consideration from Colonel Woodville for his services in rescuing and protecting his daughters and grandchild. The cold fact remained that he was a doubly convicted felon, and from what he had heard from the ladies and the captain of the character of the colonel, he had little doubt but that, however repugnant it might be to him as the father of the rescued ladies, he would none the less do his duty to the state by handing Rashleigh over to the authorities to be dealt with. He knew only too well the attitude law-abiding colonists would take towards one who had been concerned in an escape which had entailed an act of daring piracy and the death of at least one army officer. He would have to make restitution with his own life. It occupied to him with some faint stirrings of hope that, as all the rest of the party with whom he had escaped were dead, and there was no one to prove that he was personally concerned in that affair, he might be able to concoct some credible story which could convict him of nothing but successful escape. Unassociated with the worst crimes of piracy and murder, escapes from the lime-burners' camp were frequent, and it was not unusual for convicts to throw in their lot with the blacks. If he decided he could carry off the tale that he had simply disappeared in the ordinary way, his future would be hardly blacker than it had been before his escape. Probably he would be sentenced to 50 or 100 lashes, and either return to finish his term at Coal River, or even revert to the status of an ordinary convict. The day before the Seamew was expected to arrive at Sydney, he went to Mrs. Darby, and after apologising to her for his apparent deception, told her the truth about himself, omitting any details about the actual circumstances of his escape, while frankly admitting that he was a runaway. He begged her that she would, in consideration of the services he had rendered to her, intercede on his behalf with her father to obtain from the governor a pardon for his offence of escaping. Mrs. Marby listened to his story with increasing surprise, but without giving any hint of revulsion from him at finding that the man who had seemed to her a hero was really a convict masquerading as an aborigine. "There is no question of what you must do at present," she said, as he stood uncertainly before her, awaiting her command. "You must continue in your character as a black. You have been successful in deceiving me, my sister, and the captain and crew of the ship, and there can be no difficulty in continuing to do so for a few days more. I shall, of course, do everything I can to persuade my father to help you, but it may be that his official position will make it difficult or impossible. Anyhow, you must remain to everybody but me, the aboriginal black they all believe you to be, until I tell you to reveal the truth." Rashleigh promised to be guided entirely by her, and for some moments she paced the cabin. "Oh," she resumed suddenly, with fervour, "I cannot bear to think of you losing your freedom as a result of saving our lives. That would be too dreadful. I would sooner you went back to the bush again, and lived on with the blacks, than that you should go back to suffer the miseries which you tell me you endured on the Coal River." She held out her hand to him with great friendliness. "You can rely upon me to do everything I possibly can to win my father's interest for you." Her transparent sincerity filled Rashleigh with new hope, and he lay down to sleep that night with an easier mind than he had known since the voyage started. When he awakened, the Seamew was already running up the harbour of Port Jackson, and when he emerged from his berth, it was to surprise the captain by appearing in his full native dress, with painted body, opossum skin cloak, and hair decorated by Eni with grass and feathers. Hitherto he had always worn European clothes, which he had taken from the lockers of the Tribune, but, following Mrs. Marby's instructions, he went ashore as a full-blooded black. Colonel Woodville was immediately informed of the safe arrival of his daughters, but was too ill to come down to the quay to meet them. A carriage was sent down to take the sisters to the house, and Mrs. Marby asked Rashleigh to go with them. On reaching the house, he was taken in charge by the servants, who idolized their master's daughters and were very cordial in their welcome to the man, black though he might be, who had been responsible for their safe return home. At the same time, they treated him just as they would any ordinary black, using him as a butt for their absurd jokes, much to his astonishment and annoyance. Rashleigh quickly dispelled this derisive attitude by showing himself well able to act in a civilized manner, explaining to them that he had been reared in a white family. They looked upon him as some sort of monstrosity at this, being quite unable to understand how any man, having once enjoyed the advantages of civilization, could return to the life in the bush. They then told him that an apartment was to be provided for him and his gins by the express orders of Colonel Woodville. In the afternoon, Mrs. Marby sent for him and explained the joyous shock of their safety, after so long a period of suspense, had given her father a setback in health, and that, therefore, it would be unwise to speak to him yet about Rashleigh's predicament. She told him that the colonel was most anxious to see his daughter's deliverer as soon as he could, to thank him personally for all that he had done for them, and meanwhile he begged that Rashleigh would bring his gins with him and make his home in the house, having declared that as long as he had a shilling left, Biella and his womenfolk should have part of it. Rashleigh thanked Mrs. Marby warmly and accepted her father's invitation, saying that he would return to the Seamew for that night and bring Eni and Tita with him in the morning. He asked her not to press him to take the money she offered him, as he had sufficient for his needs in his belt, and in any case was to be away only one night. Captain Bell greeted him eagerly when he got back on board, where he found his two gins impatiently waiting to show him what looked like a whole milliner's shop of finery which the captain and crew had bought for them. He stood staring at his two faithful companions, who, with the help of the steward, had robed themselves in an astonishing assortment of white women's clothes, reminding him of characters like Paul Blazer of Portsmouth Point in startling conspicuousness. They strutted before him, full of such a swagger of childish pride in their new possessions, which made them so like their white sisters that Rashleigh broke into helpless laughter, discomforting them entirely. Captain Bell, however, restored their spirits by asserting that they were to take no notice of him, as he was only jealous at not being able to cut a dash himself. Hearing this, the affectionate Amy at once pulled off her bonnet and begged her Biella to wear it, and only when he promised her that he would go and dress himself up in character with them would she put the bonnet back on her own head. The crew then decked him out in a pair of striped trousers, an anchor-patterned shirt, a gaudily designed handkerchief, and the gayest looking jacket they could find, and then the whole party then adjourned to a public house known as the Black Dog on the Rocks. A private room was engaged, with 2 fiddlers and a number of ladies of the pavement, and the seamen settled down to enjoy a night's proper spree, carrying it on till an hour after sunrise. They spent the following nights in the same way, trying to prevail upon Rashleigh and the 2 gins to join them regularly. He, however, excused himself as often as he could do without offending the good-hearted fellows, while the gins resolutely refused to go again after the first night, when they had been scared by a fight which had occurred between 2 of the white women. "No, Biella," said Amy, "we not come. White men sometimes pretty quiet, but white women big devil when they drink firewater." They were now living at Colonel Woodville's house, and were content with the comfort and pleasant strangeness of the unaccustomed mode of living. Rashleigh had been in Sydney nearly a month before his host was well enough to see him. When he did send for him, Rashleigh was overcome by the warmth and sincerity of his gratitude for the rescue of his daughters and grandchild. "Now, Biella," he concluded, with tears in his eyes, "if there is anything in this world that I can do for you, you have only to name it. At least, you will always have a home here, and I will see to it that neither you nor yours will ever want." Rashleigh, very moved by the generosity of the old gentleman, glanced across at Mrs. Marby, and thought he saw her give an assenting nod to his unspoken inquiry as to whether he should now tell her father the truth about himself. "I hope, Colonel Woodville," he said, "that for your daughter's sake you will forgive me for having attempted to deceive you, as it was Mrs. Marby who asked me to wait until you were well before telling you the truth about myself. I am a runaway convict, and was driven to escape because I could no longer endure the miseries of the lime burners' camp on the Coal River. I can only say that my colonial record is clean, and has not been stained by any crime except that of escaping from servitude." Colonel Woodville listened to this brief confession with obvious amazement, and sat for some minutes looking silently at the floor. His eyes were full of pain and unhappiness as he raised them at last to look at Rashleigh. "I never felt until now," he said in a sad voice, "how hard it can be to have to perform a duty. So long as I thought you to be a man, you seemed to be. My home with all it contains were free to you. But now that you have declared yourself a fugitive criminal, there was only one course open to me. I am sorry." With a gesture of reluctance, his hand went out to ring the bell to summon a servant, but Mrs. Marby, divining his intention, interposed. "Oh, Papa, what are you going to do?" she asked in a tone ringing with emotion. "My duty, child. I must give the runaway up," he answered, his expression betraying the hardness of his duty. "What?" said his daughter vehemently. "Will you give up the man who has saved our 3 lives, and who has trusted your generosity by telling you the truth, which would never have been known but for his own confession?" You will hand this man back to the brutes who tortured him so terribly that he would rather risk death in escaping than endure it any longer? Fly, Rashleigh, fly while there is time. Go back to the bush and live in safety, and try to forget the ingratitude of your own race, and call upon me if ever you need help. At least you shall find one white person whom you shall have no cause to remember as ungrateful." "No, lady," said Rashleigh quietly. "I do not blame the colonel, for I know that he cannot do other than his duty. I can only hope, sir," he went on, turning to Woodville, "that if you find that I have spoken the truth about my colonial career being free from crime, you will intercede to prevent me being sent back to Coal River." The old man had sunk back into his chair, with his face hidden in his hands. At the runaway's appeal he looked up. "No one has ever before accused Hugh Woodville of ingratitude, and you, Lucy, know how you have wrung your father's heart by your hard words. No, listen to me," he went on, as Mrs. Marby made as if to speak. "I will do all and more than Rashleigh asks. I will see that a strict investigation is made into his colonial history, and if I find that he is not all corrupt, I will exert all influence I have to secure his freedom." "That is like my dear papa," exclaimed Mrs. Marby, embracing him, "and I am sure from his conduct towards two helpless women that he will merit all your kind interest." The colonel then told Rashleigh that he would next morning wait upon the chief convict officer and speak to him on Rashleigh's behalf. He to give himself up at the same time. He told his daughter that she should ask for an audience with the governor for herself, her sister and son, and tell that gentleman the full story of their rescue by Rashleigh. At 10 o'clock next morning Rashleigh went to Hyde Park Barracks, and a little later Colonel Woodville rode up on his horse. Rashleigh was summoned into the office of the chief convict officer, with whom the colonel was sitting. The official questioned him closely about the particulars of his servitude, and then ordered a clerk to bring the volume of convict records which contained Rashleigh's entry. As he opened the book, he turned again to the prisoner. "What ship did you arrive by when you were transported?" "The Magnet, sir," answered Rashleigh. The official turned the leaves of the book, muttering to himself the while. "Ralph Rashleigh, per Magnet. Yes, here he is. First offence, absconding and robbery. Sentenced, death. Respited. Newcastle, 3 years. How many times did you get punished at Newcastle?" 9 times, sir." A troublesome fellow, I'll be bound. How many robberies did you commit while you were in the bush?" demanded the official. "Not one, sir," answered the prisoner firmly. "Of course not," remarked the official sarcastically. "In that case, how did you live?" Rashleigh then gave a true and frank account of his first meeting with Foxley, and made much the same defence of his position as he had done at the trial. "A very pretty and well got up story," the other observed. "Now, sir, can you bring any title of evidence that you have spoken the truth?" Rashleigh then told of all that had happened at the Shanavens, and how Mrs. MacGuffin had successfully petitioned on his behalf. Colonel Woodville, who had listened attentively to everything that had been said during the interview, took the Shanavens' address from Rashleigh, saying that he would visit them and discover whether they corroborated his story, and the officer engaged to write to Newcastle at once for particulars of the circumstances under which the prisoner had absconded. He then ordered Rashleigh to be strictly confined, but the colonel interposed. "He came to me of his own accord yesterday," he said, "and told me his story, which I believe to be true. I cannot think that he has any thought of running away again, and you would oblige me very much by treating him well until these inquiries are completed." The convict officer, who had treated the colonel with very marked respect, agreed readily to oblige his superior, and Rashleigh was allowed to go among the other prisoners in the barrack yard. Here he was at once christened Sambo on account of his colour, and was subjected to so much annoyance in the way of tricks and practical jokes that he found it necessary to trash 3 of the ringleaders before he could get any peace at all. During the evening, Colonel Woodville's footman came to see him with a message from Mrs. Marby to the effect that the governor had received them very kindly, but could promise them nothing until his colonial character had been established. She begged him to keep up his spirits, the footman said, and as an earnest that she did not for a moment forget him, she sent an ample supply of money and the request that he would send to her for anything he might want. Rashleigh, having asked the man to convey his sincere thanks to his lady, said that he would be glad if she would send him some nitrous ether from the chemist's, with some other chemicals. These were sent to him without delay, and he set about trying to remove the black stain from his body. The lotion with which he anointed himself was so strong that it caused the skin literally to peel off, and in the morning, after the night of its application, his convict companions were astounded to see him with the black outer skin hanging about him in strips, and they immediately dubbed him the piebald man. It was a very painful process, but he was content to put up with the discomfort for the week which passed before it was completed, in return for the satisfaction of being able to appear in his natural colour once more. He found, on looking at himself in a mirror, that he looked quite youthful again, the effect of the black stain having been to age him by 20 years. During the 10 days which he spent at the barracks, Mrs. Marby and her sister sent him daily messages of encouragement, and on the 10th day he saw Colonel Woodville ride into the grounds of the barracks. Almost immediately Rashleigh's name was called, and he was shown into the superintendent's office. The officer stared at him as he entered, and asked him who he was. "Ralph Rashleigh, sir," he answered. Hearing his voice, the colonel burst into laughter, saying, "Good Lord, it is you! Somehow I expected to see you still black. I can hardly believe, even now, that you are the same man who saved my daughters." "You may thank Colonel Woodville all the days of your life," said the convict officer, using a milder tone than previously, "and you ought to serve him faithfully, for it is only through his influence that you are not to be returned to Coal River to finish your sentence there. You are now assigned to him for the present." "Yes," said the colonel, "that is the best I have been able to do for you at present, but I have a promise from the governor that if you behave yourself well for 1 year, he will recommend you to the home government for pardon." Rashleigh was too moved to do more than murmur a few words of thanks, which the colonel brushed aside with an understanding gesture. "That's no more than I owe you," he said. "It is I who owe you thanks. Will you now go up to the house? But wait until I come before you see my daughter. I wouldn't miss for anything seeing her surprise when she sees her black deliverer appear as a white man." On arriving at the house, the steward took him to a room by the colonel's orders, and gave him a respectable suit of clothes, and told him to remain where he was until he was sent for. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon he was brought into the drawing-room, where he found that the colonel had staged his little comedy well. As he entered, Colonel Woodville turned to his 2 daughters and the boy. "Ladies, permit me to introduce my new servant to you," he said formally. Mrs. Marby and the others looked at the stranger with mild interest, and as no one spoke, the old gentleman turned to him. "Have you no tongue, sir?" he asked with a smile. "Pray, what is your name?" "Ralph Rashleigh, alias Biella," answered the new servant, entering into the spirit of the colonel's joke. At the sound of his voice, the little boy ran at once into his arms. "Well, I suppose we ought not to be surprised to see you in your natural colour," said Mrs. Marby, "but I'm afraid I shall always think of our preserver as black. White though you are now, you are very welcome, black or white, and I know that you will prove to my father how right and well-founded is my good opinion of you." "I do not doubt it now, Lucy," said her father, "for I have heard another excellent account of his conduct in trying to save a poor girl from destruction, and I cannot believe that a man of such generous impulses can be corrupt at heart." "Well, well," said Mrs. Marby, with a sigh of relief. "Let us hope that your troubles are now over. Rashleigh shall go as overseer on my farm at Hawkesbury, and his wages shall be half the profits from the land. Will that satisfy you?" she asked with a smile, turning to Rashleigh. After stammering his thanks, Rashleigh withdrew and went to find Iny and Tita, and was surprised to find that they seemed quite unable to resume the old familiar relationship, now that he was a white man. They had certainly seen him as a white man at the very outset, but that to them was different. He attempted to speak to them, as usual, in their native tongue, but was then and always after repulsed by them by a demure of distant respect. They remained with him for years, but he never succeeded in breaking down the shy reserve which they maintained towards him. "You white gentlemen now, no more blackfellow," they would say, and go about their work. Rashleigh took charge of the management of Mrs. Marby's farm at Hawkesbury, until he received a conditional pardon for his services in rescuing her and her sister, and after a few years was transferred to New England to manage a sheep farm which Captain Marby had purchased and stocked. The sufferings which he had endured as a result of his crimes had long since destroyed his weak tendencies towards evil-doing, and he lived long enough to establish for himself a reputation as a man of scrupulous integrity, in whom every one who knew him put utter trust. He died at a comparatively early age, in 1844, at the hands of the aborigines. The squatters near Beatty Plains had long been troubled by the depredations of a tribe of hostile aborigines, and Rashleigh happened to be visiting a friend in that district when a messenger came with the news that the shepherd had been killed and the flock driven off by the blacks. Rashleigh and his friend at once mounted their horses and galloped off in pursuit. They came upon the camp with the marauders towards sunset, and saw the sheep penned in a rough stockyard made of boughs. The blacks made off at once on the appearance of the two horsemen, who immediately started with the flock towards home. They were passing a dense thicket when native war yells startled them, and, before they could act, a great volley of spears were flung at them, and Rashleigh fell pierced by 7 of them. As he toppled from his horse, he called to his friend to fly and save his life. His companion galloped off to the nearest station for help, but when the rescue party arrived, Ralph Rashleigh was dead, his body having been terribly butchered by the bloodthirsty aborigines. His body lies in a grave on the peaceful banks of the Barwon. The end.
Well, that was part 6 of the story of The Adventures of Ralph Rashleigh by James Tucker. I hope you got something out of that, at least some interesting tales. A different time and maybe a bit tall in the retelling, but still intriguing. I guess I'll say goodbye now. Until next time, I wish you well.